Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Thomas Princen, who will discuss his latest book, Confronting Consumption. Welcome to Rip Rap, Thomas.
Thank you.
This is, as I think they say in New England, a plain speaking book about the way people consume the finite resources we have. Before we get into the deeper overall issues, I thought it would be helpful if you provided some background on how you and your co-editors, Michael Maniates and Ken Conca, decided to write this book and what you hope to accomplish by doing so.
Sure, they're happy to. Actually, it's interesting you say plain speaking, because one of our aims in this book was to speak to more than just an academic audience. We really have felt that our combination of our professional lives and our personal lives, that this is a kind of topic, consumption, or more properly, overconsumption, that speaks to everybody. It's not just some esoteric topic that a few people are concerned about. In our sort of everyday discussions with people, we find time and again that if you mention the word consumption, people just resonate to that. They understand it. They understand there's a problem. They certainly don't understand what to do about it. So to answer your question, in some ways, that's what this book is an attempt to do, is to try to help people from a wide variety of backgrounds and professional orientations to think about the issue of overconsumption.
Well, and I also said plain speaking because you don't pull any punches. I mean, you really put the issues right out there, and I thought that was very helpful. They're clearly defined, and you point out at the beginning of the book about it's not necessarily impolite talk to really confront this issue, and I thought this is a real service that you've done with your presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
And you mentioned along the way, there's this debate about SUVs and energy, and some of the recent books have come out lately, like Affluenza. There's starting to become, I think, an awareness that maybe we're just using too much stuff. Yeah,
I think that you're absolutely right, that what we have sensed is that at one level, and it's kind of the grassroots level, that, as I said before, that people are aware that there's such a problem, and yet at the policy level, or in academia, or even in, of all places, the environmental community, there isn't that much discussion, or in fact what we find is there is a real avoidance of this topic. And it really perplexed us for a long time. See, in our field, we all the contributors to this volume deal in one way with environmental issues. Researchers, we're teachers, we're writers. And yet every time we look at an issue, whether it's water scarcity or global warming, ozone depletion or biodiversity, whatever it is, the prevailing approach is what we might call a production angle on these problems. That is, that if you have, for example, an issue of deforestation, one studies it, one examines it, analyzes it, gathers lots of data, and explains it as a problem of bad production, mismanagement of the forest, or poor trading practices, for example. And so then the prescriptions that follow from that are, let's correct the production, let's produce better. And often what happens, in North America, for example, we have done a wonderful job preserving, valuable stands of forests, redwoods and sequoias and so forth. But at the same time, we're consuming more and more wood products. Where does that come from? If we only deal from the production perspective, then one can save one's own forest, but displace that problem somewhere else, to Chile or the Siberian forests or wherever. And so what we tried to do in this book is say that if we're really serious about global environmental problems and getting onto a sustainable path, it's not enough just to solve one's own local production problem. One must deal directly with the consuming of those resources as well.
Well, and there was that phrase in the book, opening the black box of consumption. And I thought, boy, there's a really potent image, because that's one of the things. I think maybe we ought to have you define what you mean by consumption.
Well, as you saw in the book there, we go to some length in the defining exercise, and I won't go through all that. I don't imagine it's useful. But what we try to do is first of all, is to expose the prevailing notion of consumption, which comes out of economics, wherein the entire economy is divided between production and consumption, supply and demand, producers and consumers. And the whole enterprise of understanding consumption from an economic perspective is to try to estimate demand curves, try to understand how a change in some condition will affect the demand curve and hence the prices and the outputs in a given market, say. And for those purposes, that kind of the production-consumption dichotomy is very useful and very powerful tools in economics. But for an entirely different kind of question, namely, again, what we're calling overconsumption, those tools are not so handy. And so what we try to do is redefine consumption, not as simply the opposite or the flip side of production in an economy, but as the entire range of activities that all humans, in fact all organisms, engage in. That is, we're using up stuff. You eat an apple, you're consuming it, you're using it up, apple's no longer there. But of course, then we go a step further and say, well, obviously we have to eat and we have to provision ourselves. But if we do it to an extent that we undermine the very biophysical basis of our economy, then we're in trouble. And that's a very different kind of consuming than the consumption that's estimated in demand curves, for example. So the short answer to your question really is that we define consumption as consuming, as using up. And we also, and we think of that in aggregate terms. What is the overall impact on ecosystems, on the biosphere, and hence on our economy and our livelihood? The other way we use it is in terms of consumerism, which is more of a belief system or an ideology of that value and identity comes from consuming products, and we deal with that too. But the primary sort of ecological cut on this, the ecological consumption is this using up and risking irreversible changes.
Well, that's one of the things that fascinates me about the book is this individual dimension. That, it's not just the corporations producing product, but then there's this accumulative thing of all these individuals buying the product and using the product, and what is the long-range impact of all that? Mm-hmm.
Well, the individual side of it, this is one of the trickiest things we dealt with in trying to sort of make sense of what an politically ecological consumption would be, is that, again, from the conventional economistic perspective, consumption is that which individuals do. You and I go to the store, we buy something, we take it home, we eat it, whatever it is, we consume it. And again, from the economic perspective, you aggregate all those and then you get your demand function, or that part of the economy. But what we came around to believing is that there's both the individual side, what individuals are doing, and there's the collective side. So for example, I decide that I want to get my gray car out here, buy my gray car. That's my own individual decision. But where I go, or how much I drive it, it's not entirely my own individual decision. It's a result of collective decisions that have been made over many years that have led to the kind of infrastructure, the transportation network that we have. I don't have anywhere near as much choice in my transportation if I'm going to function as a normal American, if I want to do something other than drive a car. And those kinds of, that constraint on my choices is a result of collective decisions, and not all of which I've had a part in designing.
What's that concept that you discuss about consumer sovereignty? And I really enjoyed that. Maybe you can explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, this again comes out of economics,
right.
And the reason we dwell on that a bit is because even though many people have not been trained in economics and don't know the analytic tools per se, that discipline, as we read it, is the dominant social science discipline, not just within the academy among academics, but it is the dominant discipline within policymaking. And so its concept, its way of understanding the world, pervades virtually all policymaking at all levels, from the local to the global. So consumer sovereignty originated actually about a century ago as an analytic device to construct a whole set of analytic tools in economics that allowed, again, for some analytic power, and it helped create this dichotomy of producer-consumer, and it helped theorize the demand function. And the basic idea behind it is that consumers decide what they want to buy, and producers produce. Maybe I can tell a brief story about a colleague of mine. He did a study in Chrysler Corporation, and he was interested in CAFE standards, the fuel economy standards. And the basic question he asked in different ways of different sort of mid-level managers in Chrysler was, you know, you have the technology to produce more fuel-efficient cars. And you all know about the problems of pollution from the cars. You know about global warming and so forth. You know that our society as a whole would be better off if the cars were more efficient. Why don't you just produce more efficient cars? Okay? And the answer he got over and over again was, we'd be happy to produce more efficient cars if only our customers demanded it. We only produce what our consumers want. Now, at first he thought they were just kind of giving him a little, song and dance, or he was brushing them off a little bit. But as he asked it over and over again, different people in different ways, he get the same kind of answer. And what he came to conclude, and we talked about this to some extent, was this was not just kind of a ruse, a clever arguing stratagem. It was a part of a core belief system, namely that what they are doing in Chrysler, and Ford, and in GM, and every other producer, what they are doing is supplying what the consumer wants, and they are merely responding to the consumers. Now, at one level, it's very compelling. I mean, it's kind of hard to argue with that at one level. Namely, if they didn't produce things that people wanted, people wouldn't buy them, and they don't buy them, you can't produce them, there's no profit. So at that level, it's absolutely true. But this idea that the consumer is sovereign, that rules the economy, as it were, completely ignores a few other things I already mentioned before about the fact that I don't have complete choices, transportation choices. I have choices between my gray car and my pink car, but I don't have complete transportation choices. Those were a result of a series of decisions, which Chrysler, I assume, and others were heavily involved in creating the transportation system that we now have. So it ignores that. It also ignores the fact that American business as a whole commits $170 billion to advertising. Now, if they were merely responding to consumers, as these people firmly believe, why do they need to spend $170 billion? It doesn't seem very, economically efficient, and yet they do. And I don't have the figures for lobbying and for political campaigns, but we can imagine they're influencing how decisions are made. They are not merely responding to the consumer. And this, by the way, all this this is aside from the external impacts of their production decisions and the consumption decisions, such as ozone depletion and global warming and so forth.
So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, we have to respond, but we're responding to that which we set into motion.
That's right, yeah.
Then you kind of juxtapose this idea of cautious consuming. And I thought maybe you'd like to explain that, because I found that pretty interesting. Yeah.
This was, we came up with this term, if you recall, it was only a few years ago that we had an exuberant economy. It was the go-go 90s, and the sky was the limit. With the dot-coms and so forth, we were just into a new era. The business cycle was broken, and and so on and so forth. And the belief, just when we were writing this book, was that we'll never again will fall into recession, let alone depression. And the whole challenge is just to do more and more and more. And the question we raised through the consumption angle is, at what cost doing more and more? What cost all this exuberance, these rapid changes, and these the ever increasing use of material? What is exactly being risked? And in a strictly financial sense, it wasn't until very late in the 90s, and even after that we really saw what the true risks were of the kind of activities, the WorldCom and Enron and so forth. And that's just in a strictly financial sense. But in an ecological sense, there was this assumption that if you were, say, telemarketing or telecommuting, that you weren't using resources. That if your office became more computerized, you could save paper and therefore save the forest. But studies have shown that the more computerized the offices got, the more paper is consumed. In other words, in this exuberant economy, we were putting ever greater stress on ecosystem services. We were risking irreversible changes. Ozone layer, depletion of ozone layer is probably one of the most dramatic examples, and a success in reversing that. But climate change and loss in biodiversity, topsoil, fresh water, all those are other major issues that just did not go away. In fact, they intensified through this exuberant producing. And so the antidote, as we conceived it, was something like cautious consuming. When I go down to the supermarket and I buy those strawberries in middle of winter, gee, it's sure nice to have fresh, delicious summer fruit in the middle of winter. But a cautious consumer would ask, where does this come from? At what cost? What's in this? What do the producers get? What do they do to their soil in order to get this to me in the middle of winter? And more broadly, at a policy level, cautious consuming begins by asking, what is used up? Who's benefiting? Who's losing? What are the long-term consequences? Not just long-term in terms of the next election cycle or the business
next
cycle.
Stockholders meeting.
But long-term in ecological sense. It says, if we keep on this pattern, can we really imagine that the fresh water will always be there, the topsoil will always be there? That's what we mean by cautious consuming.
Well, that's what I found really attractive, is taking this long view approach toward how the rate of consumption, and along with it you had the 4 R's, the recycle and reduce and reuse and recover. But it's all part of not only just taking, but also being aware of putting back and maybe not using as much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At several points in the book, you and your co-authors have some really sharp comments about the ways that those in public life, including governmental and academic leaders, dare or need to ask people why they consume. They don't question whether people or societies are better off with their accustomed patterns. And in chapter 1, you even take a little bit the academy to the issue about not being particularly helpful in searching for insights. And I wonder if you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Maybe first on the public officials, then I'll get to my own home turf. How's
all
that?
Right, okay.
I think all my colleagues would agree is that if any one of us, for some strange and bizarre reason, found ourselves in Congress or in Lansing, that we would not be talking like we were talking in the book, right? That you cannot survive and you cannot represent your constituents in the current political environment by constantly asking the consumption question, confronting consumption as we say it. But what I would like to think is that public officials can survive and can make a difference in a different way, but asking some really fundamental questions like who gains and who loses, what are the long-term effects, as we discussed. In the current political realm, and especially in the last couple of years, I mean, it's just completely off the table. But our premise is that one can defer those costs for only so long. One can keep increasing CO2 emissions, but at some point those chickens come home to roost. And at that point, even the policymakers will have to ask, what are we consuming and why are we consuming? But to the academy, as I read it, academics are, are like everyone else. They're in part a product of their environment, their cultural setting. And at least within the social sciences, there is still a pervasive, almost reverence, as I mentioned before, for economics. It is sort of the physics of the social sciences. It's quantitative, it's very sophisticated, theoretical, and so forth. And within many disciplines, political science, and sociology, and others, there is this emulation of economics as a discipline. And I think in part, and because economics is completely oriented towards the production side, and only brings in, say, environmental impacts as an externality, and never asks the overconsumption question, then the predominant questions that we ask, even in political science or the field that my colleagues and I are in, or it's international political economy, the economy of international political economy is still the production of goods and services. So I have a colleague, for example, who looks at oil spills and wrote an entire wonderful book on it. But it was all about oil, sort of the production side of oil and transport of it. Never even a hint of where's this going to? What's it being used for? Is it necessary? Does it contribute to other environmental problems or social problems? I can't explain why those kinds of questions haven't emerged until very recently. But I think the best explanation probably is this sort of economistic orientation of the academy. But also that our society as a whole tends to think that consumption is the end thing of the economy. The real thing is the production, and that's what we have to focus on.
Well, see, I thought that was a pretty courageous thing to do, to bring up. I think part of it may simply be that people haven't really thought about it. It was presumed that things would always kind of go on the way they are. There used to be a lot of trees, so why not just not think about what's going to happen if there aren't trees? Yeah. I think there's kind of a luxury of the plenitude of things, and so then you don't have to examine that. Yeah. Somebody along the line, like you and your co-editors and co-authors, is starting to look down the road and say, perhaps we better take a look at what all this, what's happening here. And that's what I thought was really attractive about the book. The other thing is that you and your co-authors take issue with what you call comforting terms. There's that thing floating around about sustainable development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, actually, on that particular that particular term, we had some disagreement among us on that, because I still use the term. In fact, I teach a course, I use sustainability anyway. I teach a course on sustainability. So I find that the term, the concept, maybe more properly the ideal of sustainability is important, is critical, but like other sort of major ideas, whether it be democracy or even peace. These are terms that are used and misused all the time. And what sustainable development what has happened to that term is it's been pretty much co-opted by so many different groups, corporate and governmental, and even the usage by many environmental groups as we read it. It means a little bit more than environmental improvement or economic growth conventionally defined, which has to date included ever-increasing material use, with some environmental protection thrown in. That's kind of what we're getting at.
To prettify it a little bit.
Yeah, it's sort of a green, business as usual, but green it up a bit.
Put green in your ads.
Yeah, right. And then there's that greenwashing side of that
right.
too. But there's a more serious component side of it as well, and we don't want to deprecate that too much. The sustainability, the whole sustainability concept really does underlie much of what we are saying here, is that we as a species have to figure out what many of our forebears already did figure out, and that is how to live within the carrying capacity of the ecosystems we depend on.
I noticed that you quoted your colleague Donella Meadows.
Yes.
And what she was talking about, asking the tough questions.
Yeah.
About ending growth, the purpose of economic activity, what's being consumed, and who's benefiting at whose expense.
Yeah, and those tough questions they can be aimed at oneself, so reflective. Why do I need that third car? But what she was really getting at, and a major thrust of our book, what we're getting at, is it can be aimed at the larger collectivity, at one's workplace, one's city council, one's legislature, Congress, whatever else. All those, there's always, my own personal experience is, there's always a setting when one can ask those tough questions. To give you one example, I went to a band concert at Forsyth Middle School here where my son played. And the principal introduced the band and everything. And he said, and I have one announcement you'll all be happy to hear. When you come to these concerts, many of you have to park way out there in the street and walk all the way to the school. We have now gotten approval to build a parking lot that will serve 100 more cars. Okay. Now, if this was something other than a band concert, if it was a planning meeting, there was the opportunity. So, do we really need 100 cars? Why? Just for that, for the 2 band concerts every year? And for that matter, is it really that horrendous for people to walk 200, 200 yards to hear the children play? But those are tough questions, because I can guarantee you that at best people will just kind of smirk, or they'll do what happened to me, or they'll hoot you down. They'll shoot you down, they'll hoot and holler at you, because you just don't ask those questions. Of course we need more parking. And to confront consumption means, maybe we don't. Maybe we need to ask about that.
And if we look at the sustainability, the whole issue of where are we headed if we don't, it might be a good idea to start acting now. Well, listen, thank you for appearing on Rip Rap. You're a delightful guest.
Thank you very much.